I think we're now in a new direction where it's not just the marketing and the PR and the news articles saying these things about where Marvel is going. I think Marvel is going down that path, and I've said, perhaps I've even said it on Midnight's Edge, that I believe that that Mr. Feige, who is now a member of the club, a bona fide member of the club that I mentioned in Hollywood, is being fed bad advice because the club doesn't like newcomers, and he's a newcomer, right? And so for a decade, as Scarlett Johansson pointed out, for a decade, these were popular movies with no political agenda, with no feminist agenda, no sexual agenda. They were just fun movies, right? And they had flawed characters. Tony Stark is a playboy, and that's who he is, and he's an insensitive guy, and they went with it, right? And so that represented what the audience wanted, and Mr. Feige gave the audience what it wanted to his tremendous success, allowing him to enter the club. And the club doesn't really like this newcomer. And so what happens when you join the club? They start giving you bad stock advice so that you lose your money and leave the club. And so he's being given bad stock advice right now, which is you got to make this political, man. That's where the market is. And once you get in the club, the excitement of finally being accepted as a member of the hierarchy of Hollywood makes you very amenable to their advice, which isn't coming from a well-intentioned place. And Mr. Feige is now leading in a direction that I think will not help his brand.
Marvel's Black Widow, the movie that kicked off Phase 4 on the big screen, has been released. While praised by critics, the reception among fans has been decidedly more mixed. A contributing factor to that is no doubt how the studio chose to portray and sell the movie ahead of its release. With me to discuss that marketing strategy, the movie itself, and what it may lead to in the future is our good friend, writer and producer Kamran Pasha.
I'm delighted to be here, Andre, and I'm delighted to talk about this movie in particular.
In the weeks leading up to the release of the movie, the marketing shifted from the usual array of posters and movie trailers that were already out there to setting up a narrative. We already covered this in our previous Black Widow video, but to briefly recap. In an interview with Collider, Scarlett Johansson suggested that up to this point, Black Widow had been sexualized and treated as eye candy by other Marvel characters in general, and by Tony Stark's Iron Man in particular, before emphasizing that not only does she now feel a greater sense of self-worth, society is more evolved now and ready for this Black Widow. In a follow-up piece in Time magazine titled, Black Widow Begun as a Sexist Stereotype, more than a decade later, Scarlett Johansson is reclaiming her story. Victoria Alonso, Executive Vice President of Production at Marvel Studios, takes it even further, suggesting that all past MCU movies were problematic, and that all previous Black Widow appearances were about the male gaze, and symptomatic of pre-Me Too Hollywood. Scarlett Johansson is presented as someone who had to fight the system for years to elevate Black Widow into a real character, in an MCU dominated by too many white guys called Chris. The conclusion, though, is that Marvel now has seen the error of its ways, and is committed to that from here on out. Women, at long last, will redefine blockbusters for millions around the world. In other words, activist talking points all around. Emphasizing this, early reviews, such as IndieWire's viral one, took great delight in claiming that the movie takes men to task and makes them squirm. Hence, the marketing machine put out a narrative which strongly suggested to most males and a good chunk of females in the built-in audience that unless they at the very least were good allies, Black Widow might not be for them. As a result, quite a few wrote the whole movie off there and then. Kamran, why would the studio put such a confrontational narrative out there?
Well, this is a continuation of the woke marketing that we've seen since really the Ghostbusters reboot, and it's unsuccessful form of marketing that we've already seen. It didn't help Ghostbusters, which actually was a woke movie and actually was what they claimed it was, and it didn't help the other ones that were marketed as that weren't that, in an effort by these marketing teams who are deluded in believing that this is going to touch the current zeitgeist and that this is what the current audience wants, because the people that are actually believing that kind of marketing aren't actually interested in watching these movies. They talk about them on Twitter, they talk about it on social media, they champion these things, but they don't go and buy tickets. And so this is the continuation of a marketing paradigm that we've seen now for about 4 or 5 years, and it's literally a dead horse that they keep beating. So that's part of that. So that's just with regards to the marketing approach. Now, with regard to Ms. Johansson, anyone who's been following her, and I'm a fan of hers, anyone who's been following her interviews, she's been on this, I've discovered my feminism shtick for a couple of years now, right? This is not new. This is her talking in these words. And again, I can't judge what's going on inside of her. I will say that it is very interesting that, her earlier roles, by her own admission, she was fine with them being sexualized. She was fine with being herself sexualized. And very much, I think Ms. Johansson knows her attractiveness and knows her power of the gaze. And I don't say the male gaze. Women love her too. She knows that she attracts attention, that she's got charm, sexuality, physical presence, all of that. And in my experience, most actors are very happy to be sexually desirable. It is something that is both personally something that makes them feel, an ego rise, and also helps them professionally to get roles and options. And so the problem is, it is gauche and crass to say, I love being sexy and attractive. So a great many attractive people pretend that they are not, and certainly in Hollywood. And they pretend to be embarrassed by it, pretend to be embarrassed by the roles that they lovingly, willingly took on, because it just makes them feel like they're being cheesy. And so whether that is what Ms. Johansson is going through, or whether she really is stating her evolved perspective now that she's in her 30s and she's a mother and she's no longer the 18-year-old ingenue, I think I will leave that to the viewers to determine for themselves what's really happening there. But I think it is a phenomenon that we've witnessed with her for some time that's being appended to this movie.
Something else Scarlett Johansson has been talking about in the lead up to the movie's release, no doubt at the studio's behest, is pay inequality in Hollywood. All while she earns more than many of her male MCU co-stars, and she's been the highest paid actress in Hollywood for several years in a row.
Equal pay is a huge part of that fight. When I was a teenager in the industry, or a young woman, I should say, my mom, would have those conversations like, why is she not getting, it had never had anything to do, there was always these like, these little key terms like, bankability and, box office draw. And those are all those are all terms that are basically masquerading as sexism. It never had anything to do with those things. And if there ever was, it was also part of the systemic issue that, a woman could not be as bankable or have a same box office draw.
It's an embarrassment of riches phenomenon, right? Where people that themselves are not the victimized, oppressed person feel kind of embarrassed about that. And so they have to champion these narratives in order to keep the gun off them. And remember, she's gotten the gun on her a lot. She's made a lot of comments in the past few years that have gotten her into trouble. When she did that movie that was based on the Japanese anime, I believe, where she, it was the ghost movie. Forgive me, I'm forgetting the title.
Ghost in the Shell.
Ghost in the Shell. Thank you. And which I enjoyed. I thought it was a fun movie. I liked her in it. And but it's the original character was Japanese, and in the movie, the truth of her character is that it was a Japanese person that has been implanted into this physical form that looks like this white woman, right? And so she had to distance herself from the drama that was creating there. But instead of distancing herself, she said, well, she said something that I agree with, which is that, why can't I play this character, right? I can play this character, and that caused outrage amongst the woke. It actually caused a lot of bad PR for her when she stated that race shouldn't matter. I should be able to play this character, and then I'm sure her agents and her PR people said, you can't be saying this kind of stuff. That's not where the culture is right now, in the sense of that's not where the media is right now. And you're going to get attacked, and that's going to hurt your career and going to hurt our money stream. So suddenly she suddenly goes from saying those things. She was known as a very outspoken person to suddenly becoming a very follow the flock narrative person in the last couple of years. I think there's a commercial reason for that.
Based on the narrative put out there by Marvel themselves, and how that narrative was supported by some early reviews that went viral. Many had in advance drawn the conclusion that the movie had to have an outright misandrist slant. But now that more and more have seen it, many seem to be of the opinion that while the movie is not without messaging, it is not another Captain Marvel, which was the worry going in. How do you see it?
Well, I am of the opinion that it is a good movie. I enjoyed the movie. I will go watch it again. And I did not see the woke political agenda being pushed, as has been aggressively in other films, to their detriment. Everyone has to determine for themselves what their opinion is of this film. I've already had arguments with people on Facebook over this, and I understand why some people are critiquing it. I enjoyed it very much. What I will say is, it is not the movie that is being mythologized in the media. I think others in the fandom, like Anna, that Star Wars girl, have said, that the media is manipulating a narrative around this movie to its detriment, which I think is happening. I mean, I think there's people out there that are already saying, I'm not going to go see this movie because I'm going to presume that it is exactly what they're claiming in these interviews, where in my experience, it was not. The male gaze or female gaze, the gaze was not averted. Ms. Johansson is quite lovely throughout. Florence Pugh is quite lovely throughout. There are beautiful women in this movie. They are not wearing burqas, and I'm a Muslim, so I can say that. And they are very attractive, and their sexuality is not hidden. In fact, there's some really fun moments where Florence Pugh's character kind of calls out Black Widow for her the fact that she enjoys being the center of attention and enjoys, acting in a way that attracts the male gaze. And that's a little bit of a humor of that movie, because there's truth to that. And even Black Widow can't deny the truth to that, which I think is the opposite if you want to be preaching woke stuff, to say, have one woman say to another, I think you like being sexy. And the other one's kind of acknowledging that I kind of do, but I don't want to admit it. That's sort of the story of what's really happening with Ms. Johansson, right? And the movie acknowledges it. So, and I felt the gender dynamics, personally, I felt the gender dynamics were perfectly fine. You have her taking on bad guys. You have her taking on bad guys that are men and women. And the male character, many people have criticized sort of the character that that's supposed to be her foster father, not her real father, but her.
Now, this would be the father. That wasn't really the father. He was someone on a 3-year mission, after which he spent the next 2 decades in jail and couldn't really see her because he was in jail.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that character is that there's a really interesting arc. He's not, people said, they're making him weak. He's not weak. Physically, he's a superhero. He's the only actual superhero in this movie. He's a super soldier, sort of like Captain America, which is shown from the very early moments where he's got physical abilities that the others don't have. But what he is someone that has been ideologically brainwashed by his group. And he's someone that is in many ways just an insensitive jerk. And he's at 20 years in prison to become an even more insensitive jerk. So that when he's reunited with Scarlett and with her younger sister, he has to face the fact that he's an insensitive jerk. And then he has to learn how to be the kind of father that he should be and should have been to them. That's actually a character growth. That's not a mocking. That's not all men are bad. This is a guy with superpowers who wasn't their father and now has to learn how to be their father. That's actually a very interesting character journey for me as a writer.
On the topic of male characters, You have previously spoken about how Hollywood likes to cast submissive black men as opposed to strong black men. And in this movie, Black Widow has an ally, an armorer who happens to be a black man, a very safe and non-threatening one, to the point that he doesn't even charge her for his services. Instead, we are led to believe that if Black Widow will call him her friend, that is reward enough. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it is true in Hollywood that there has been this thing about keeping the strong black man down. I've witnessed it. I've argued about it in writers' rooms where I think that we are emasculating that character, and I'd like to know why we're doing that. So, I mean, that is a real phenomenon. I do think this character, again, it reflects this movie. On one level, that's what it appears to be, right? You have this non-threatening black man who just helps her, right? That's what you have. But on another level, he's actually someone that is her ally in a real way. He doesn't feel like a weak follower. He's got his own life. He tells her, it's because of you that I'm losing clients, right? You know, people, because you've got a bounty on your head, and I'm your friend. I'm losing clients. That's a problem for me. He confronts her that she's actually not paying him, and and he can't help her without resources, which is resolved at the end of the movie. And also, there is this wonderful thing, which is, you have this, and he's a handsome guy. So he's not Urkel. He's not this weak guy. He's a handsome, attractive black man that you could see her hooking up with. I personally felt there was a little bit of hidden sexual tension between them two. And at the very end, spoiler alert, at the very end, there's a moment where she says, "You're such a good friend." And he says, "Every man loves hearing that." And that's self-deprecating because he clearly doesn't want to just be her friend. He's actually attracted to her, right? And in a traditional Hollywood woke movie, he'd be like, yes, madam, I'm so happy and honored to be a friend. He's like, no, I'd like to be more than that. And she sort of winks and, smiles it away, which suggests that she might not be close to that too. It's just right now her life is very chaotic. So I think, again, that's symbolic of this whole movie, is that on a superficial level, you think you can find all of these tropes, strong women, evil men, weak black men, all of that. But that's not what this movie is, in my opinion. There's a lot of self-awareness to it. There's self-awareness to Scarlett Johansson's characters, to Black Widow's sexuality. There's self-awareness to it. Other characters comment on it, and in fact, try to mimic it, try to be as sexy as she is naturally. That says that there's a quality to that. That's a good thing that others, for all their mocking it, really want. And this character wants to hook up with Natasha. And
we can see him staring at her ass.
Yeah, and and we were all staring at her butt too. All of us were. That's how the camera held on to it for a reason, right? And that's okay. That's a fun dynamic between these two. In fact, it's just something that made their relationship seem a little real, right? If he pretended he wasn't attracted to her and was happy with being her friend, then that's not real, and that's a woke mythology about male-female dynamics. And so I appreciated that. In fact, the audience laughed when he said, "Oh, I'm your friend." I guess every guy likes to hear that. The audience laughed because they could feel the truth of the situation there. And that's what this movie had. Some of the best laughs came when the woke tropes were struck, and then you could see how silly they are. That's where the laughs in the movie came, because it allows us to release the tension of this moment we're in, where people are preaching all this stuff to us that we don't feel is true, and the characters don't really feel it's true in this film, and you see that.
Let's shift focus to a female character, and in so doing, draw a comparison to WandaVision. There, Wanda Maximoff held an entire town hostage, mentally scarring everyone in it in the process. When she finally allowed her captives to go and pick up the pieces of their lives, she was told that those ingrates would never know what Wanda had given up for them, namely some figments of her imagination. The point I'm making is that Wanda got away scot-free and didn't face any consequences for her crimes. In Black Widow, the mother character is instrumental in the villain character being as powerful as he is. As such, she is also responsible for the Black Widow program still being active and worse than ever, because now there is legit mind control going on, and she's the reason for that. Like Wanda, she too appeared to get away scot-free. What's up with that?
Well, the mother figure, that you're right, she's shown with all these flaws. She's not heroic for much of this film. And again, we're going to give a spoiler here, but the character turn is she has the chance to repent, and she's had this guilt about everything she's done and about what she did to these two girls who she was a mother figure to in particular. So I don't think she gets off scot-free. I think she has to face the consequences of her actions. She ends up injured in the film, and there is this sense of someone finally redeeming themselves after a life of doing the wrong thing, which is what Darth Vader is. I don't see the people in the fandom complaining. Anakin Skywalker killed little children with his own hand. He helped blow up an entire planet. And then he does one thing. He saves his son, so he's a good guy now. We all went with it, and I still think that's the right character arc for that thing. But he's a lot worse human being than she was. And we all embraced the character turn, right? And so I think that critique isn't fair to her. If she came out of that unscathed, with no repentance and no consequences from that, I think that would be a fair critique. And I don't think that's what this movie did. In some, a woke person whose agenda was all women are good would justify her actions and would excuse her and would let her get off scot-free. And I don't feel the film does that.
Ever more audiences seem to conclude that Black Widow wasn't as infused with political messaging as the narrative Marvel put out there leading up to the movie's release would have us all believe. However, the Disney Plus series WandaVision, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and Loki genuinely were everything that Marvel's Victoria Alonso suggested to Time magazine that Black Widow would be, but which it ultimately wasn't. What is so noteworthy about that is that Black Widow was made before any of these Disney Plus series. It only opened after them due to lockdown delays. In the bigger scheme of things, what is the significance of that?
Well, I personally believe Black Widow is the last of the good MCU movies from that old era when it was just about storytelling, right? And then the new MCU era began after Black Widow was really finished. I mean, yes, we had Captain Marvel, which was the outlier in in fact, even in the Endgame movies, they had the new people were like, who's this Captain Marvel? They didn't really, the characters didn't like her, which meant the directors understood the critique that people were giving of that movie, where it fell into the evolution of Marvel. And Black Widow is part of that earlier vision, in my opinion. And that's why I didn't feel it was a preachy movie. I didn't feel anyone was giving me all women are good, all men are bad. And I didn't feel that there was a message to desexualize Black Widow or any of the lovely women in this movie. In fact, their beauty and their sexuality is very much natural to the film, and so it is the last remnant of the MCU that I think most of us loved, in my opinion. And so, I think we're now in a new direction where it's not just the marketing and the PR and the news articles saying these things about where Marvel is going. I think Marvel is going down that path. And I've said, perhaps I've even said it on Midnight's Edge, that I believe that, that Mr. Feige, who is now a member of the club, a bona fide member of the club that I mentioned in Hollywood, is being fed bad advice because the club doesn't like newcomers, and he's a newcomer, right? And so for a decade, as Scarlett Johansson pointed out, for a decade, these were popular movies with no political agenda, with no feminist agenda, no sexual agenda. They were just fun movies, right? And they had flawed characters. Tony Stark is a playboy, and that's who he is, and he's an insensitive guy, and they went with it, right? And so that represented what the audience wanted, and Mr. Feige gave the audience what it wanted, to his tremendous success, allowing him to enter the club. And the club doesn't really like this newcomer. And so what happens when you join the club? They start giving you bad stock advice so that you lose your money and leave the club. And so he's being given bad stock advice right now, which is you got to make this political, man. That's where the market is. And once you get in the club, the excitement of finally being accepted as a member of the hierarchy of Hollywood makes you very amenable to their advice, which isn't coming from a well-intentioned place. And Mr. Feige is now leading in a direction that I think will not help his brand.
It would appear then that Kevin Feige may be taking Marvel down the same general path that Kathleen Kennedy took Star Wars. And just to refresh everyone's memories, that worked so well that audiences fled, box office and merchandise sales tanked, and Jon Favreau had to come in and right the ship. And it still remains to be seen how that will work out. How long do you think it will be before Marvel needs a similar rescue mission?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, I think Mr. Feige is now embracing this new path and being advised to do so by people who don't have his best interests at heart. And so I think we're going to go down this path for a few more years, perhaps 4 to 5 years. I think this next phase will not be as successful as it could be and not be as successful as the previous films were. It is not as overt as what happened with Star Wars, which just had this incredibly poor storytelling and ridiculous Mary Sue characters that in many ways disrespected the actors and actresses who had to play these characters. I don't think we're there yet with Marvel. I think we're still at a place where we're still having interesting characters do interesting things, but we're having overlaid on top of it certain agendas and conversations that are unnecessary. When I'm saying that, for example, we say female driven, Black Widow was a powerful female character, right? And she was always an interesting female character. Loki, by his own myth, is a shapeshifter that takes on female forms. So there was no reason to make any commentary about those characters. They're already there in the story. There's no reason to add any commentary. If someone wants to take away from it, I'm so proud that Loki is gender fluid. Oh, that's a personal takeaway. Great. Good for you. There's no reason to add any commentary. It's who they are. The difference is that now it's being used for a 2021 political commentary rather than the just the inherent nature of the character. But because it's the inherent nature of the character, it is not the same as what was done with Star Wars, where you twisted and destroyed characters for a political narrative. So I think it's going to take a longer time for there to be significant pushback that Mr. Feige is going to have to notice and react to it. Whether people at Lucasfilm liked it or not, they had to notice and react to the fact that the audience was revolting quite rapidly. And even if they resented the audience, they had to react to it. Whereas I don't think Mr. Feige yet knows that the audience, at least a good portion of it, doesn't like this kind of stuff being added on top of otherwise good stories. Because I just don't think it's gotten to a place where the stories are themselves bad. They're just adding this hectoring layer to it, which is unnecessary. And it's going to damage them, perhaps not as much as it damaged Star Wars because it's not as extreme yet. If it becomes like that, once we start seeing Mary Sue characters and we're seeing, there's one thing about saying, okay, well, now a black man has the Captain America shield. And another thing about going back and making, Captain America, a loser and a jerk. And, you're already beginning to see some of that in these comics where Captain America is no longer proud to be American, right? Once they start going down that direction and rewriting these characters, I think the reaction will become more volatile. And we're already seeing that within the comics. So it's going to be a process ahead. We're looking at least 5 or 6 years of this. And if it gets extreme, he'll have to react to it. It's just unfortunate because none of this is necessary. None of this is necessary for this franchise. You don't need to add any of this on there. It's inherent there. My thought is this. I actually would urge people to go see Black Widow. I would urge them to go see it and come to their own conclusions. I would urge people to not listen to the media. You may walk out of that movie saying, I didn't like it for X, Y, and Z. Perfectly fair. Right? But don't come to that conclusion preemptively based on a media campaign done by stupid people. That's not, in my opinion, what this film is about. I think there's more than enough in this film to entertain people. Someone may dislike this change to canon. But even the changes to canon, in my opinion, were done for storytelling purposes and not for political ideological purposes. The nature of the villain was used to show Natasha's human failings and how she overcomes them. So she's not a Mary Sue, right? And so that to me is good storytelling. Yes, it differs from how it was in the source material, but I don't think it degraded the source material as a result of that. That to me is the line, is when you degrade the source material rather than you're adjusting it for a storytelling point. And that actually, in my opinion, strengthened the character in this film. So I think people should see this movie, come to their own conclusions. You may not agree with my assessment, but make your own assessment. Don't let this media tell you what this movie is. Don't let Ms. Johansson tell you what this movie is. Come to your own conclusion.